Welcome to the module on basics of interview techniques, especially in corporate industries where you suffer a lot as far as the interviews are concerned. So this is an introductory chapter on corporate interview tips, which will cover the basic etiquettes one has to follow in order to make sure that your interview is successful. What is an interview? An interview is essentially a structured conversation where one participant asks questions and the other provides the answer. So in common parlance, the word interview refers to a one-to-one conversation between an interviewer and an interviewee. The interviews usually takes place face-to-face or in person. In simple words, an interview is a conversation where somebody is trying to get information from another person about their knowledge on a particular subject. The person asking question is the interviewer and the person answering the questions is the interviewee. Researchers use an interview to ask people to find how they feel or what they know about something. Similarly, the industries conduct interviews to select their workforce in order to actually get the work done in the right manners, whether the competency of that particular person who is being selected is fit for that particular job or not. And there are other types like you can have the leaders being interviewed in order to comment or give their opinion on a particular issues. So today we will be talking about especially the corporate interviews where the corporate industries select people to check their competencies on a particular subject and offer them the right position in the industries. 9 major types of interviews we generally have, that is informational interviews, screening or telephonic interviews, individual interviews, small groups or committee interviews, the second or on-site interviews, which is also known as the review interviews, behavior-based interviews, because this is most common in all types of interviews at all sectors, because behavior plays a major role as far as a selection of people in the industry is concerned. Task-oriented or testing interviews is more confined on the areas for which the interview is being conducted. Stress interview is generally used in all types of positions, in all types of interviews to check the level of stress one can have or one can hold during their interview sessions, and given a scenario whether they will be able to cope up with that stress or not. And then during this COVID pandemic situation, virtual interviews are more popular, where you are virtually visualizing people through some softwares, giving a video calling or an audio calling, or on a virtual platforms we connect and try to get being interviewed, where multiple interviewers are being associated at different locations, are connected on a single platform, a virtual platform, and the interviewee, the candidate who is to be interviewed, is present in front of them virtually, and they interact with each other to get knowledge, get an idea about the competency of the candidates. So for a corporate interview techniques is basically a combination of one or more than one type of interviews. That is the combination of informational interviews. They do conduct telephonic or the initial screening based on some criterias. Of course, individual interviews are there more predominantly in the corporate level before the pandemic, but now after looking at the situations and the scenarios, maybe that these individual interviews will get less impacted, will get more impact and will be done less, so that people can get connected through virtual platforms. And then They also prefer to have on-site interviews as far as the corporate, especially for the operator levels, for the supervisors levels, where they actually judge them because on the site only, because they don't have much of a qualification in terms of the book knowledge, but they do have a good exposure on practice. So, our example, like if you are selecting a driver or an operator or a key person to run a machinery, he has to have an on-site interview in order to make sure that he knows the job. Then the behavior-based interview is also equally important. The task-oriented or the testing interviews and the stress interviews, and finally the virtual interviews where you have been given a virtual scenario to tackle with less stress and a good behavior. So in my opinion, whenever you attend a corporate interview, these are the techniques the corporates generally adopt in order to judge the competency of the candidate and for his final recommendations on the suitability of the job. So when we say stress interviews, which is also important interview technique and generally taken in almost all the type of interviews, a stress interview is an interviewing style where companies use to gauge a candidate's response to a particular stress level. The idea is that it will give the hiring team an idea of how one will respond when juggling various high priority tasks, dealing with challenging clients, or facing a difficult co-worker or a manager. So generally he or the candidate has been given some scenarios which are not actually in favorable conditions, and he has to tackle the stress what is being observed because of the acts he has chosen to take care of. Second is the task-oriented interviews, where generally the interviewer inquires a lot about the specific task for which they are hiring. Like for example, if it is related to highways, if you have an opening related to highways, then most of the questions related to the highways will be asked during the interview sessions. If it is related to hydro tunnels, obviously more of questions related to tunneling and hydro sectors will be expected during the interviews, like what type of shotcreting it is, what is the conditions required in order to do a good shotcreting, in order to control the wastage in the shotcreting, so on and so forth. And when it comes to the airport, again, it is more related to a specific type of industries. So specific questions related to the specific industries are more preferable. And people also would like to have your inputs, your views, your opinions, and your experience in that particular area and how you are actually explaining the things to them. Similarly, you can have railways, you can have marines, you can have all other sectors where specific task-oriented interviews are more preferable because they are more particular, and a particular experience in that field is required, because the line of actions, the activities involved in those areas are different from the common sectors. Like if you are from a infrastructure industries, then you will not be a best fit for the building sectors, and if you are from a building sector, you are not a best fit for the infrastructure in case of some particular trades. So this is really important to take the task-oriented interviews. And under the task-oriented interviews, again, you can have subdivisions like execution, design, and planning. So specific to the area where you would like to have the task-oriented interviews will frame their questions in that line only. Like if you are related to execution, more questions will be in the form of execution-related questions, and if you are in planning, more questions will be related to planning form of profile. And if you are in design, definitely you will be asked more questions about the design parts only. So how these questions will be framed, what all the typical questions one can have, we will be dealing all these things in detail in our subsequent modules. We will start with the highways in the upcoming modules, and then in highways we will first cover the quality department, then we will take care of the execution and then planning and so on. The third part, the third attribute which is most important is the behavior based interview, where the interviewer tries to judge the behavior of the candidate under a critical or a difficult situation. The situation can be like posting at a remote locations where he was not expecting this from the interviewer, and your response to this particular question is I can say that your response to this particular situation will a lot depend upon the response you have. Like for example, if you are okay with the posting at any locations, even if it is a remote location, that means it gives a positive feedback to the interviewer. And the moment you try to avoid, the moment you try to say that you are not comfortable in locating yourself to a remote locations, and your options or your chances of getting the opportunities is very dicey. And then the second situation which one can generally get to check their behavior is adverse working conditions, especially during these COVID scenarios where you are lacking in manpower, you are lacking in resources, and if your manager has asked you to give a particular work output in a particular given time, even if with the limited resources, and you have to suggest him what innovative ideas you have in mind, rather than if you deny straight away saying that you don't have manpower and you will not be able to act on this particular area. So there is a negative feedback which transmits from the interviewer to the interviewee, and the chances of you being selected is minimized. And then of course the typical nature of an interviewer is to behave rudely with the interviewer, to understand his behavior under that adverse conditions. Like if his manager is rude, and if his manager is scolding something unnecessarily, so what will be his reaction on that? So based on your reactions, your selections are based. So basically in the corporate interviews, if you see the behavior based interviews and the stress based interviews, the weightage of these two types of interviews are more as compared to the technical interviews, because nowadays the knowledge part is easy to gain even if you don't remember, but you will able to capture those things through the social platforms. So knowledge is not that important, but the behavior and the attitude and the stress you are able to deal with is important as far as the corporate interview techniques or the corporate selection criteria are concerned. Some of the signs of good positive interviews, if you see, like if you are asked to come in for an additional round of interviews, that means you have done to the extent required, and they are expecting something more out of it, and possibly you will be selected for this particular post. The hiring manager tries to sell you on the company, like what they do, how big they are, and what is their like positive things and negative things, and how you can cope up with the stress levels in the organization and so on. And if they ask you a lot of personal questions about your family, your personal goals, your hobbies, your location of stay, and what are the complications you have in your family and so on, that means they are trying to be more formal. And the interviewer, if he nods and smiles a lot during the interview, it gives a sign that you are on the right track of being selected in the interviews. So these are some of the situations where one has to have a positive framework of mind to answer, and before answering anything you have to be very attentive in listening what the interviewer is asking, and then accordingly you need to react in a positive framework of mind with a smiling face to represent. So the presentation of the individuals during the stage of interview is more important during the virtual platforms also, because now in the virtual platform you are not actually getting in contact with those people, but on a virtual platform you are trying to see. So network connectivity and poor voiceovers, all those things plays a vital role. So you have to be very careful when you are choosing your mode of interview, and during that mode of interview you have to be very attentive in terms of the connectivity, in terms of the language, in terms of the volume, the way you speak, and in terms of the politeness in answering the questions which are being asked to you. So the science of you got that right. If you see in my language, some of the signs are the body language gives it away, like the way the whole situation is during the interview, the body language of the interviewer, the body language of yourself, and the body language of the counterparts who are the team members who are being a part of the interview system. And when you hear when and not if you are hearing when, that means it is a good sign that you are on the right track. Like for example, when you can join is some of the questions. When the conversation becomes more casual, like they ask you some common questions, some casual talks, not specific, not stressed. When they indicate that what you say is being hearing by them and they like it, and if you are being introduced to the other team members who are not a part of the interview panel, so that is also a good sign to think about that, yes, you are on the right track. There are verbal indicators which also indicates that how soon you will be able to join, what is your notice periods, and what if you have been asked to join immediately, and so on. And when they ask about the salary expectations, so that means you are almost you are almost on the verge of hitting the bull's eye. And the moment they discuss about the perks and the other criteria, that means your interview went well, and technically you have come out of this interview process successfully. What you should have while facing the interview is you should have a positive framework of mind, you should have a positive energy, you should be flexible in answering the questions, you should not show your rigidness towards a particular situation, towards a particular location. You should be confident. You should be confident in answering your questions. Like how confident you are shows that yes, the depth of knowledge which you have in answering a particular situation. So the confidence level has to be at high, but overconfidence is also very dangerous. So like if you are answering something really silly and still you see that you try to maintain your confidence level, so that becomes an overconfidence, and people think that he is too dramatic rather than attentive and expecting to do a particular work. Because remember that interviewer is also sometimes a candidate and interviewee, so he knows how the tone is changing your behavior, how the behavior is reacting with your mind, what is the gap between the thinking and the speaking process. So the moment you try to overreact, you will be easily catch hold of, and it will go as a negative feedback for the interviewer in terms of selection. So always be polite, always be very cool, and try to maintain the situation very favorable as far as the whole interview process is concerned. You should be presentable, like you should not be aggressive at any point of time, but of course little aggression can be seen, but it cannot be too much. And you have to be factual. You need to understand that something, if it is not possible to accept, like if you say that sunset is always on the east, and if you say yes, yes, it is true, then you got that wrong, because sunset is never being on the east. It is always on the verge. So some facts which cannot be changed, you need to adopt, you need to understand those things, and you need to be very careful while answering those questions. And you need to be attentive. You need to be attentive while answering the questions, because without proper attention, you will not be able to understand the question, and possibly you will get the answers wrong if you are not attentive in answering the questions. In order to hit the bull's eye, you need to be very smart. So I try to set some guidelines one should have, so that the chances or the probability of hitting the bull's eye will be close to 90%. So in order to make sure that you should hit the bull's eye right in time with the right energy and right confidence, you should have a common sense, because civil engineering is basically a subject of common sense. Most of the activities are being carried out with great delivery, with great time cycle, if you have a good common sense in place. It also needs intelligence to handle the situations, like being a civil engineer. So most of us are directly exposed to the public in high risk zones, like maybe it is issues related to noise pollution, issues related to land, issues related to air pollution, issues related to some technical problems, like you can have an issue with the concreting of highly congested reinforcements. So under all these situations, you need to have a intelligence. You need to understand how intelligently you can tackle the situations, and how intelligently you can be able to transform the scenario from a negative feed, from a negative balance to a positive balance. Then the third property one should have is has to be vigilant, because the vigilancy shows the confidence you have in the subject. Vigilance shows how attentive you are in actually judging the situations, and how accurate you are in utilizing your common sense and intelligence. Then you need to be innovative, because not necessarily every time you get an innovative idea, but if the situations are not right, but the resources are limited, then you need to come out of that situation with innovative ideas, in order to make sure that the work is being done on time with maximum output and minimum efforts. And then finally, the good point is you need to be a good listener. You need to have a good ears to make sure that yes, whatever is being asked, are you able to deliver those things or not. Without understanding the situation completely, if you try to jump into the conclusions, you might lose the vigilance, you might lose the bull's eye. So it is always important to listen carefully the questions which are being asked during the interview system. Like for example, when we say what is curing, generally people ask why curing is required, but it was never being asked why curing is required. When you are being asked what is curing, you need to answer that particular question only. So in order to make sure that you will be able to tell that correctly, you need to have a good listening capacity. You need to develop your listening capacity to the maximum possible extent. So with these few things in mind, being a civil engineer, I can say that civil means you should have a common sense, you should have an intelligence, you should be vigilant, you should be innovative, and you are a good listener. That is what is being coming out of an individual being a civil engineer in place. And these ideologies or these points will definitely help one to grab the opportunities which are there for you. Remember that because you have a big competition as far as the openings or the opportunities are concerned, and these are the simple things which makes different from others. So you have to be different from others. You have to show your competency which is being different from others, and then only you will be able to grab the situation, and then only you will be able to hit the bullseye right at the place. So to summarize this module, we talked about the definition of interviews. We talked about the different types of interviews. What is a stress type of interview? What is a task-based interview? And what is a behavior-based interviews? And what are the good signs of indications to understand the situation of the interview or the status of the interview? In the next module, we will be covering the possible questions in quality department related to tunneling, airport, marine, buildings, highways, and metro projects. So under each type of business, we will be trying to address some of the typical questions generally you get, some of the logical questions or some of the tricky questions you will get where the chances of you being misled in terms of answers will be discussed in terms of say whether it is soil or bitumen or concrete. So, and all these types of businesses, we will be discussing various questions one can have in terms of bituminous materials, in terms of soil and aggregate, or in terms of the concrete questions. Till that time, thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in.